Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In today's episode, we will share some true neighbors' horror stories. We all think we know our neighbors, but sometimes the people next door hide terrifying secrets. That will remind you, quiet streets turned into nightmares, late nights, but before starting the video, please consider giving us a like. Also, if you have any terrifying or unnerving experiences of your own, feel free to reach out and share your story with us. Who knows, it might even be featured in one of our future episodes. Now turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself. When Jenna moved into her new apartment, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was her first time living alone, and the building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and stained glass in the front doors. She loved the cozy vibe, though she noticed her hallway always felt a bit colder. Her neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, was an elderly woman who kept to herself. Jenna had only seen her once, shuffling down the hall with a cane. They exchanged polite smiles but never spoke. The knocks started on her fourth night in the apartment. At first, they were faint, like a branch tapping against a window. Jenna dismissed it, blaming the old building's quirks. But by the sixth night, they grew louder and more deliberate, always at 3 a.m. "Who could be knocking at this hour?" she muttered, clutching her phone for light as she peeked through the peephole. No one was there. She tried ignoring it, but sleep was impossible. Every night, the knocks came. Jenna grew paranoid, triple-checking her locks and leaving the hallway light on. She mentioned it to her best friend Sarah, who joked, "Maybe it's Mrs. Whitmore sleepwalking. Old people do weird stuff like that." The idea seemed plausible, so Jenna decided to talk to Mrs. Whitmore the next morning. She knocked gently on her door but got no response. A muffled cough from down the hall startled her. It was the landlord. "Oh, hi," Jenna said, embarrassed. "I was just trying to check on Mrs. Whitmore. I've been hearing knocking at night, and I thought maybe she needed help." The landlord gave her a puzzled look. "Mrs. Whitmore doesn't live here anymore. She passed away. Oh, about 6 months ago. This unit's been vacant since." Jenna's heart dropped. She mumbled an awkward thanks and rushed back to her apartment. She couldn't believe it. Was it a prank? Or something worse? That night, the knocks came again, louder than ever. Jenna was too scared to open the door, but she pressed her ear against it. Amid the knocking, she swore she heard a faint, whispering voice calling her name. "Jenna, let me in." Terrified, she screamed, "Go away!" And just like that, the knocking stopped, for good. Jenna never heard it again, but she often felt a cold breeze pass through her hallway. Whenever it happened, she whispered, "Rest in peace, Mrs. Whitmore," hoping it was enough to keep the spirit. Tom always considered himself a rational person. He moved to the suburbs for peace and quiet after years of city noise. His new street was perfect, lined with oak trees, kids playing in yards, and neighbors who always smiled as they watered their lawns. But then, there was Mr. Douglas. The elderly man lived alone across the street in a weathered house with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs. Tom didn't think much of him at first, but something about Mr. Douglas's constant presence at his window gave him chills. Every evening, just after sunset, Tom noticed the figure standing in the window, staring directly at his living room. At first, Tom thought it was a coincidence. Maybe Mr. Douglas was watching TV or enjoying the view, but the more he observed, the more he realized the old man wasn't just standing there. He was staring at Tom. Tom tried to shrug it off, even joking about it with his co-worker. "I guess I've got my own neighborhood watch." But it wasn't funny anymore when it started happening every night. Even with his curtains drawn, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He swore he saw a shadow move behind the curtains one night. Frustrated, Tom decided to confront Mr. Douglas. He crossed the street and knocked firmly on the door. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Douglas?" Silence. The door was locked, and the house seemed deserted. Confused, Tom went home. The next day, he mentioned the encounter to his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carter. Her reaction shocked him. "Mr. Douglas?" "Tom, you must be mistaken. He passed away last year. No one's lived in that house since." Tom laughed nervously, thinking it must be a mix-up, but Mrs. Carter's solemn expression told him otherwise. Lila had always been skeptical about small-town gossip. When she moved into the rental on Elm Street, her neighbors, the Crawfords, seemed lovely, a young couple with a baby boy. They brought her cookies and introduced themselves, laughing about how their son, Ethan, was a perfect angel because he never cried. At first, everything seemed normal. The Crawfords were polite but kept to themselves. Lila occasionally heard faint music from their house, but she never heard the baby. One day, while having coffee with Mrs. Crawford, Lila casually mentioned it. "Your baby's so quiet. I don't think I've ever heard him cry." Mrs. Crawford's smile faltered for a split second before she replied, "Oh, he's just very well behaved." The response felt rehearsed. As weeks passed, Lila noticed other strange things. The Crawfords rarely brought the baby outside. The curtains in the baby's room were always drawn, even during the day. And then there was the smell. A faint, sour odor that seemed to linger around their house. Lila's curiosity got the better of her. One afternoon, when the Crawfords were out, she walked around their backyard. She saw a basement window and crouched to peek inside. The room was dimly lit, but she could make out an old crib in the corner. Then she saw it, a bundle of blankets in the crib, decaying and yellowed with time. Lila froze. The baby wasn't a baby at all. It was a doll, rotting and covered in cobwebs. She stumbled back, horrified, and ran home. That night, the Crawfords didn't return. Their house remained dark and empty. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, a "for rent" sign appeared on their lawn. No one ever saw the Crawfords again.